All right, folks, welcome to the Monsters, Madness, and Magic podcast. I'm your host, Justin, here with a quick word before we dive in. Now, in this episode, I chat with role playing and video game designer Warren Spector about his vast personal library, heroic fantasy, Space Gamer magazine, Ultima, the dawn of Deus Ex, and more. As always, thank you all for listening out there. And without further ado, here you go. All right, Warren, I want you to just take us back in time. You're a youngster. Are you a book reader, fort builder, troublemaker, or all of the above?
I'm a book reader. I'm sitting in a house that is entirely my library. I have a house I live in and a house that I call the library. I have 17,000 books
Oh, wow. Oh, man.
and an entire room over here for board games and an entire room for magazines. So I started early. I read a lot of comic books. I read a lot of Famous Monsters of Filmland, great magazine. I read a lot of science fiction. I started with Tom Corbett's Space Cadet. At one point, I could recite the entire first book, Stand By for Mars, but now all I remember is Stand To, you rocket wash. Uh, that's the opening line of Stand By for Mars. Read When Worlds Collide and After Worlds Collide, Heinlein juveniles. Yeah, I was definitely a reader.
17,000 books. You're going to have to do a tour one day of like a virtual tour of your house. I'd love to see that.
Uh, yeah, it's well, I've only got 10,000 over here, and 3,000 over at the house I live in. 4,000, and about 3,000 at a. I have another house which is a art gallery, music, and exercise space. So they're about 3,000 over there. So that adds up to about 17,000.
How many of the 17,000 would you say that you've read? Have you read a good bit of
Oh,
them?
everybody asks that. I can't remember what it is. There's a Japanese word for having more books than you will ever read in your life. I've probably read 25% of them. But the
I'm
key is, like, if I need to know anything, I mean, obviously you can go to the internet now, but when I was working on Wings of Glory, a World War One flight sim, all I had to do was go over to my shelves, and there's a full shelf of World War One airplane books. And if I
I'm
want
with
to
you.
know
Yeah.
about chess, I've got two shelves full of chess books. And learn a language, pick your language. I got a couple of shelves of books about that. So anything I need to know, I know how to find.
That is the dream, and that's exactly how I think. I'm a collector. I don't have 17,000, but I'm a collector of books as well. And I just want to have the information if I need it, even if I never read it.
Well, I mean, I've got 7,000 Kindle books too. My
Mm.
wife won't let me bring another real, dead tree book into the house. So you never know what you're going to be in the mood for.
Yeah, just curious. Since obviously you're a reader. Did you ever read any epic fantasy? I guess like Robert Howard or things
Oh,
like that.
yeah. I mean, Conan and Cull and all that was definitely a part of my childhood. John Carter, Warlord of Mars, those books were great. Yeah, Lovecraft, I read all of Lovecraft. I mean, I was seriously into pulps.
Michael
Um,
Moorcock fan.
I've never read any Moorcock, and I shouldn't have said that publicly because he lives in Austin, the same place I live, and
Yeah,
I've never met him. We've been at the same science fiction convention a couple of times, but I've never actually met him or read any of his stuff. So
I would recommend you
yeah.
do so. It's very good. I just interviewed him a couple days ago.
Oh yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah,
had
well,
him.
I mean, Elric, I should read some of that, for sure. I've got some of it. I just haven't read it.
Hey, it's there. There you go. That's why you collect
Yeah,
it.
yeah, exactly.
When did obviously you read a lot, so did that lead to wanting to creatively explore writing and stuff like that early on?
Yeah, I when I first started out, I wanted to be a writer, and then at one point, I mean, I was always a movie fan. The first movie I ever saw was Ray Harryhausen's Seventh Voyage of Sinbad. which
Classic.
kind of got me started. And Disney's the Shaggy Dog, so I was kind of a fantasy guy from the start, and then early experience watching King Kong. So I fell in love with movies, and when I got to high school, I was just, uh, I mean, I was going to movies 7 days a week, and like getting home from school at 4 o'clock and going right to sleep and getting up at 11 to watch movies all night on TV and stuff. So I kind of segued into, maybe I should make movies.
Mm.
And then I realized I wasn't very good at making movies. So I was going to write about movies or write scripts for movies. And even now, my my next career, should I have one, is I'm going to get back to writing. I'm working on a history of Warner Brothers cartoons right now. And I've got a contract, and I'm only 2 years late on my contract, but I've got a couple of books I want to write, so I'll get back to writing at some point.
Oh, since you just mentioned it, didn't you have a similar college thesis on that?
Yeah, well, that's where it got started. I wrote my master's thesis on Looney Tunes and Merry Melodies. That I stopped in 1969. I covered 1928 to 1969, and then realized, maybe I could get this published. That'd be pretty cool. So I talked to some publishers, and there was one that was in a small press, McFarland Publishing Company, wanted it. And so I signed a deal with them, but they wanted me to double the length, which would be easy because all I have to do is cover 1969 till today, and I double the length. They wanted 70,000 words. So here it is a few years later, and I've got 307,000 words so far, and still going.
You covered
Uh,
it.
uh, yeah, so I think I'm going to get done with my first draft here in a month or so. Send it off to
Wow.
them and see if they want to publish a book too big to bind. We'll find out.
You can break it down into volumes if you need to.
They may have to. I mean, it's like some epic fantasy that gets broken up.
Yeah. So clearly you are a fantasy fan. Would you consider yourself a horror fan as well? Famous monsters of filmland and stuff?
I was, and I still love the Universal horror films.
Mhm.
Frankenstein and Dracula and Boris Karloff and Bela Lugosi and the Wolfman and all of that. And I love the Hammer horror films from the late 50s and into the 60s. I'm not so much a fan of modern horror films because they're just too horrific and too bloody and too jump scary
Yeah,
and
yeah.
so I wouldn't say I'm a horror fan anymore, but I sure was. I mean, Forrest J. Ackerman, the editor and the mind behind Famous Monsters of Filmland, was an important influence on me when I was growing up, and he's passed away now. But I ran into him at a convention, a science fiction convention, and got to tell him that he changed my life, which was a pretty magic moment for me meeting that guy.
I mean, yeah, man, that's the golden era of those are the monster kids, the famous monsters of filmland and the model kits they used to come with
Oh,
them.
I
Yeah.
built all of those. I built all of them. The Phantom of the Opera, all those Aurora model kits were arranged on my mantelpiece.
Just curious, do you have all the copies of the magazine? I mean, your collection's
Uh,
vast, obviously.
I have a lot of them. I never had all of them, but I had a stack of them. And there's someone on eBay selling a disc that had every issue. So I have every issue, but I've got them in digital form.
Hey, that's something.
Yeah, I can go back and relive my childhood.
Exactly. So, what records were spinning around the house when you were growing up?
What records? There was a fair amount of big band stuff because my parents were into that stuff. And so I got into that pretty good. There was a lot of Beatles, a lot of early Beatles. I remember. I mean, I'm an old guy. I mean, I remember when the Beatles played on Ed Sullivan. We were arrayed around our black and white TV. There was a bunch of that. A little later on, I got really into ragtime, and it was only a little later on that I figured out, hey, these Led Zeppelin guys are pretty good. And
Yeah.
now right now I'm kind of in a cool jazz, like post bebop, middle era Miles Davis, Bill Evans kind of period, and kind of getting into more folk stuff because okay, I'm gonna plug this. We can talk about games at some point if you
We'll
want,
get
but
there.
I just read I read a book called New York in the 50s, which was terrific. And it's all about like the intellectual life of, Columbia University and people hanging out in Greenwich Village, all these jazz musicians and theoretical, cultural, political people and uh, folk musicians and beat poets and writers and everything. They were all hanging out in the same place. And I mean, Norman Mailer and the Village Voice guys. So I read that, and it was all from like the late 40s until the early 60s. And then my sister recommended a book called uh, what is it? Three Shades of Blue, and it's all about the jazz musicians in the same period in Greenwich Village, in the same place. So I read that, and it's like a different perspective on exactly the same time in exactly the same place. And
Wow.
that was really cool. So I got into back into jazz. And then I said, I've got a book called Positively Fourth Street, which is all about the folk scene in the same place at the same time. So I can get into that too. It's all about Bob Dylan and Joan Baez and Mimi and Richard Farina and stuff. So I read all three of those back to back. And now I'm reading a book called The Slit, which is all about the art scene at the same time in the same place. So
Wow.
strongly recommend reading all of those books together, and you'll get into all this music and reading all these crazy books. And I mean, it's been a reading adventure for me. Okay, anyway, let's talk about games or whatever you want. I'll go on for days about this stuff.
Hey, I'm with you, man. So did obviously you love music as well. Did you ever pick up an instrument, join any bands or anything?
Let me see. Played the recorder, the piano, the guitar, briefly the drums. I sucked. The clarinet. I got an electric guitar a few years ago. I now have 21 electric guitars and 6 amps. I played in a band called Wasted Youth. I dropped out of the band. We broke up because that's what bands do. My wife is still in the band, which I'm very bitter about. But yeah, I want to teach myself how to play the trumpet now. I'm kind of thinking about picking that up. So, I mean, everybody in the game business plays an instrument. I mean,
Hmm,
everybody. It's incredible. I don't know why it is, but
that
yeah,
is
I'm
interesting.
totally into it.
Did you ever play any live shows?
Yeah, yeah. Wasted Youth. We used to play science fiction conventions because we're all geeks. And my wife is a writer, and like all my friends are writers. And so we used to play science fiction and fantasy conventions, parties and dances. We played, we used to, we played a couple of clubs here in Austin. We played one charity gig. Everybody in the band hated it when I say this, but we weren't good, but we were enthusiastic.
You got to have that too.
Yeah, yeah.
I'm sorry I'm sticking on this, but you've struck a chord with me. I'm a huge nerd myself. But what would you say is the most rare book that you own?
I got a lot of them actually. Uh, the most rare book. It might be a first edition of The Hustler by Walter Tevis. Anybody who's into games, by the way, needs to read The Hustler and Queen's Gambit by Walter Tevis. They're great books. The Hustler was made into a great movie too with Paul Newman. It's about pool players, and obsession, achievement, and weakness. And great, great book. And I've got a first edition, first printing of that. I for a while I got into mysteries in a big way. And there was one author of locked room mysteries in the 20s and 30s, named S.S. Van Dyne. And I have his personal collection of first edition, first printings of his own books. So those are probably worth something now. I've known George R. R. Martin, the Game of Thrones guy, for decades now, and I've got all of his books and autographed, and
Hmm.
they're probably pretty valuable. And I mean, autographed copies may be rare. I don't know. I don't know. I've got a lot of
Yeah.
books.
Just wanted to see what came to mind.
Yeah, the Hustler is probably the rarest book I have. I mean, first edition, first printings of that don't come around every
Yeah.
day. Yeah, actually, I've also got one of the movies I've loved is 42nd Street, a Warner Brothers musical from 1933, and I saw it for the first time when I was probably 15, and just fell in love with it. And I stopped counting how many times I'd seen it when I hit 30, and like 30 times, not 30 years old.
Yeah.
And but in the credits, it said based on a novel by a guy named Bradford Ropes. And I looked for that book. I am not exaggerating. I looked for that book for 40 years. And as far as I could tell, there were only two copies. One in a research library on the East Coast, and one in a research library on the West Coast. When I was cataloging my books, I have 10,000 of them cataloged, and I came across a guy who, in his catalog, he claimed to have a copy, and I contacted him, and he did have a copy, but he wouldn't sell it.
Hmm.
And a little while later, he came back to me and said he knew somebody who had a copy and was willing to sell. So 40 years after I saw this movie, I got a copy. That's got to be the rarest book I have, because I mean, I spent 40 years looking for it,
Yeah,
and
I'd say.
I'm a pretty good book scout. I can find books.
Wow,
So yeah,
that's
that's the
awesome.
rarest book I have.
I promise we'll get to games eventually, but a question I like to ask everyone is what scared you as a kid?
What's King Kong scared me as a kid. I'll tell you. No, I mean, my sister. Okay, so my parents had a TV in their room and a big comfy chair facing the TV, and my sister was sitting in the chair and said, "Warren, you got to come watch this." And so I stood, I mean, I was like 3 years old, and I stood behind the chair watching King Kong. And there's a scene in King Kong where Driscoll is running down a path with King Kong chasing him, and he goes like there's a cliff, and he goes down in a cliff into a little cleft, a cleft in the cliff, and he's got a knife, and King Kong is like reaching down into the cleft to get him, and he's like stabbing with the knife. And I had nightmares where I was the guy running and in the cleft with the knife. I had nightmares about that for years. I
Wow.
mean, and the other thing that scared me to death was the Phantom of the Opera, where Lon Chaney's mask gets ripped off, and you see his face. And I mean, I grew up on the eighth floor of a building, and I had to take an elevator up, and there was a window in the elevator, and so you'd see each floor, and I just had this. I knew that someday that face was going to appear in the window as we're going by, and that terrified me too. And
Yeah,
Psycho, the first time I saw Psycho, I slept with a baseball bat that night, you know?
mine's Universal monsters as well. I can remember just being terrified of the Wolfman and werewolves in general. Just something about that just never sat well with me. It just scared me to death.
Oh yeah. Oh yeah. Well, there's Lon Chaney Jr. did a good job. The makeup was great. The transition, the transformation stuff was great.
Yeah,
Yeah.
terrifying stuff.
Yep.
So I'm assuming you came to tabletops before you came to PC gaming as a kid.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, like I said, I'm an old guy. There weren't, hobby games when I was growing up. I mean, it was chess and Monopoly and occasionally Stratego. That was kind of it. And the real turning point for me was I discovered Dungeons and Dragons in '78, and a friend of mine, Walton Simons, I named a bad guy in Deus Ex after him. Um, he invited me to play in a D&D campaign with Bruce Sterling, a cyberpunk author, as the dungeon master. And so it was a bunch of writers and me. I was in grad school at the time, and I played D&D. And that first night, I mean, I'm not exaggerating when I say, my life changed right then. I mean, I spent more time playing D&D with, half a dozen different groups than I did studying when I was in grad school.
It served you
And
well.
it worked out.
Yeah.
I can't really complain. And and then I discovered the Fantasy Trip and Ogre and GEV and little Ziploc bag games from Metagaming, and then Steve Jackson Games, and you know Avalon Hill Games. And I mean, I got pretty hardcore into tabletop board games, real hobby games. The little cardboard, you know, piece games that nobody plays anymore. But yeah, so I played in half a dozen campaigns, role-playing campaigns, D&D and homebrewed, and the Call of Cthulhu and a bunch of other stuff. And that was really it for me. I mean, the whole way I got into games was through that. I was teaching at UT, at the University of Texas. I was in grad school. I was working on my doctorate. The chairman of the department called me up and said they had to give my class to another grad student, so he could learn how to teach and not just me. And I had no idea how I was going to make my rent. And I got a call from a guy who I had worked with at school, asking if I wanted a job at Steve Jackson Games. Like, gee, making games, just lost my class, don't know how I'm going to make the rent. Yeah, I think I'll do that. And I had designed my own role-playing system and my own campaign setting, and was a crazy gamer. That was it. I mean, I never looked back.
Was that Space Gamer magazine?
Yeah, man, you did your homework. Um, yeah, I was the editor of Space Gamer and Fantasy Gamer magazine for a couple of years, as well as the
Wow.
editor in chief for the company. We were working on Car Wars stuff, and I got to work on Toon, the cartoon role playing game, which that came out in 1984 at Gen Con in 1984, and I still get royalties on it. It's still
Wow.
selling. I mean, that's like 40 years ago, and I'm still getting royalties on it. It just kills me. But yeah, I started out as the editor of the magazine, and the first thing I did was Matthew Costello, who went on to write for like Seventh Guest and a bunch of other stuff. I think he did Seventh Guest. Yeah, he did a solo adventure called Thing in the Darkness,
Mm.
a Cthulhu adventure, and I got to edit that and make sure it flow charted well and fix things that were broken in the flow chart and stuff. That was really the first professional thing I did.
Did you bump shoulders or run into Peter Atkinson at all?
He was way after that. I mean, he
Okay.
he he was he was a young punk. I mean, come on.
Do you guys know each other? I was you guys seem to run in the same
I've
circles.
I've met him, but I wouldn't say I know him.
Okay, okay, gotcha. So when it comes to Dungeons and Dragons or just any kind of sort of tabletop, do you prefer to be the dungeon master or do you prefer to play?
I prefer to play. DMing's a lot of work.
Yeah, it
Uh,
is.
I will say, I mean, I have DM'd. I mean, we called it the animator in Tune. I ran a lot of Tune back when I used to be funny. I did a lot of that. I ran a campaign in a game called Chill, which was from Pace Setter Games. It was one of my favorite games. I think there's a new edition out. That's worth checking out. I ran a Chill campaign. Like I said, I created my own World War II role-playing system, ran a lot of GURPS, ran some D&D, ran some Call of Cthulhu. So yeah, I mean I've done it, but it's a lot of work,
Yeah.
and I mean I got a day job. I was gonna say I'm lazy, but it's really I've got a day job.
When it comes to, the more creative side of the writing that you've done, what does your typical process look like? You a heavy outliner? Do you like to, go with the flow and fix it later?
I wouldn't say I'm a heavy outliner, but I need to know where I'm going. So I outline stuff. I've been lucky enough to, I mean, I did a choose your own adventure book, one thing after another that was a Marvel choose your own adventure. And I mean, those things you have to flowchart really carefully. That was pretty cool. I got to type the words, it's clobbering time. And I got to show it to Stan Lee. I
Wow.
mean, and get his autograph. He was yeah, he was a cool guy. Yeah, it was pretty funny. When I met him, he was giving a talk to the creative directors at Disney, and he was talking about the villain in there. What was that comic? And I would go, Fantastic Four number 37. And eventually he said, "Who are you?" But no, I needed to flowchart that one really carefully, and I got to write a novel, The Hollow Earth Affair. So I outlined that, not heavily, but I needed to know how it was going to end and then back up to the beginning and stuff. I got to write DuckTales comics for a while,
Wow.
and I needed to know where that was going. So yeah, I would say I'm a light outliner.
Mm. You mentioned the nonfiction project that you're working on. Do you still have any desire to maybe write novels or comics or anything along those lines?
I would love to write more comics. That was a ton of fun. I mean, I have to say, I don't know that I'm any good at it. Issue 3 of my DuckTales run was probably the worst comic in the history of comics. Uh, no, it was bad.
Oh
It
no.
was. I mean, I was so late that I would turn in a page, and the editor would send it to an artist who would draw that page, and then the next day I would send another page, and the artist would draw another page, and I mean, it was a mess. But it was great fun, I gotta say. I obviously I love making video games. The thing is, like, even a small team today, a small team for me is, 30, 40, 50 people. And if you like a game that I've worked on, it's because the team did the real work.
Yeah.
And if you don't like it, it's entirely my fault. I mean, I have to take the blame, but give the credit to other people. But if you like my DuckTales books, it's because I'm good. It's just me
Yeah.
with my fingers on a keyboard. And if you don't like it, it's because I'm bad.
Yeah.
And there's something appealing about that. So yeah, I've started a couple more novels, and I don't know that I'm a novelist, but I would love to write some more comics.
It seems like we're kind of skirting around it, but would you say that you ever had to deal with or overcome imposter syndrome in your career?
Every day of my life,
Yeah.
every single day of my life. I have to say, I haven't met many people in the game business who don't suffer from imposter syndrome. And I don't want to be around, let alone work with anybody who doesn't feel like they suffer from imposter syndrome. I mean, it's what drives you to do more than you think you're capable of doing.
Yeah.
And that's a good thing.
Yeah.
So
Agreed.
yeah, of course. I mean, everybody who's anybody who's worth anything is an imposter.
Well said. Now, correct me if I'm wrong on any of this, but I think it was 89 was when you joined Origin and started with Ultima 6.
Yeah, yeah. I was working at TSR. Two things happened. One is I was testing. I mean, we were all play testing the licensed AD&D games. SSI was doing the gold box games that probably predate everybody who's watching this. And they were wonderful games in that they really simulated the D&D experience. But I mean, I was playing the Ultima games and other video games or computer games, I should say, at the time. And I just felt like the gold box games, the SSI games, were simulating all the wrong things. And I've said this before, and I'll say it again. They were role-playing games, ROLL playing, and not ROLE playing games.
Mm, yeah.
And they simulated the character classes and the character stats and the die rolls. And it's like, no, that's not what makes role-playing worth doing. It's about telling unique stories with your friends. And I was on a couple of panels with Richard Garriott at comic conventions, at a science fiction convention once, and I was listening to him talking about Ultima 5 at that point. I was thinking, oh my God, this guy gets it. Like everything he was saying was what I believed. And the other thing that happened when I was at TSR was we were talking about a new game system. I don't even remember exactly the details, but the big decision was percentile dice or 20-sided dice. It's like, if that's a big decision in your life, you got a real problem. And I got a call from a guy working at Origin who had worked at Steve Jackson Games saying they were looking for somebody. Was I interested? And I like, hell yeah. So I interviewed and got the job. So there you are. And I'll tell you the funny thing. I'm sorry to interrupt
No,
you,
you're
but
fine. Go ahead, man.
uh, I got down there and I was all arrogant, and it's like I'm going to teach these computer guys what interactivity is all about. And it took me like 2 weeks to figure out I knew nothing. I mean nothing. And so Steve Jackson gave me my undergraduate degree in game development, and Richard Garrett gave me my master's degree. I owe those two guys a debt I'll never be able to repay.
So after I think Ultima 6 was Ultima Underworld. What would you say were the biggest challenges that you faced getting that off the ground?
Underworld,
Yeah.
yeah. Well, there were a bunch of them. I mean, Paul Neurath, who created Blue Sky, which was later became Looking Glass, came to Origin with a tech demo of a first-person perspective, real-time, fully textured environment. It was just a tech demo, and I remember looking at that, thinking, okay, the world just changed, and now I can see a path to making an ROLE playing game. The challenges, there were technological challenges. There was no team in place to make it. All credit to Paul. He put together a team that was incredible. It was all young punks who had
Hmm.
never made a game before and didn't know that they shouldn't be able to do what they did. There were narrative challenges. The original story was terrible, and how do you tell a story in a first person game? No one had done that before. No one had done a game, a first person perspective, real time, fully textured game before. So there were technical challenges, there were narrative challenges. No one had done a game where a player was empowered to, in a very limited sense, solve problems in a variety of ways. The Ultima 6 kind of hinted at that, multiple like pre-planned puzzle solutions. But with Underworld, the idea was to really let players interact with a very lightly simulated world that seemed very deeply simulated at the time. I mean, it was nothing but challenges because no one had ever done anything like it before. And that was also inspirational. I mean, my teams are always scared because my whole idea is if you know how to do it, why bother?
Mm.
And so I'm always trying to do things that I don't know how to do. I mean, I can't talk about the game I'm working on right now, unfortunately, but I mean, as recently as this week, I told my team was going, we don't know if we can do this. We don't know how to do this. And I said, that's exactly why we're going to figure out how to do it.
That's where you want to be.
Yeah. Yeah.
So we're talking about pretty much the genesis of the role playing and PC games as we know it. and you're in the industry, what behind the scenes, is there a game that you can recall that when it came out, all of you and your peers were just like, man, have you seen this damn game? Like this game is ridiculous. How did they do that?
Well, I mean that happens a lot. So uh, let me think of a good example or two. I mean, like I have to say this is probably not the answer you want to hear, but there was a game called Star Raiders for the Atari 800 that was a real-time 3D first person, not textured, space combat sim. That was the first time, I mean, real-time 3D, like unheard of. And I'll never forget the day I saw that and thought, okay, that that's something new.
Yeah.
And then when Chris Roberts came up with the idea for Wing Commander, let's texture those Kilrathi ships. And hey, while we're at it, let's throw a little movie in there. You know, that was pretty impressive. I don't know. I mean, that's a really good question. You've stumped me. Let's keep talking, and maybe I'll think of something. I mean, like I don't know that it's exactly holy cow, I can't believe, I've never seen this before, but I'd say Ultima Online. Like I mean, yeah, there'd been Meridian 59 before that, but Ultima Online was a game I didn't get at all when it was in development. And then when it came out, it was like, oh.
Hmm.
And then along comes Blizzard,
Yeah.
I mean, EverQuest and World of Warcraft, and you can see the development of that genre and getting more and more professional quality goes up and everything.
I just throw Doom out there. Doom, like
Well, yeah, I as a guy involved with Underworld and System Shock, Wolfenstein and Doom, you know, I love John Romero, and I don't know Carmack well, but I have chatted with him a few times, and you know, I'm a little bitter that Underworld and System Shock don't have the notoriety of Wolfenstein and Doom because Underworld shipped before Wolfenstein, and we told a story and empowered players to solve problems in different ways, and we were first. Not that I'm bitter.
I mentioned that intentionally. I'm sorry, just to see what your thoughts were.
Yeah, great, great. But no, but I mean, realistically, the idea of giving a game away free and selling add-ons, that was pretty impressive.
Hmm.
Hey, actually, and shout out, John Romero is a good friend of mine and a great guy and a brilliant designer who knows more about games and loves games more than anybody I know. His autobiography is great. Everybody should read it. First of all, because he's led a really interesting life. I thought I knew his life, and I didn't. I learned a lot, including a lot about how Wolfenstein and Doom and the business model and the designs came to be. But also because every once in a while he just throws in a couple of pages that are a master class in level design. It's totally bizarre, but great book. Everybody should read it.
I have his autobiography. It is a great read. I interviewed him when it first came out. I think it was a year or so ago. Was it your relationship with John? I think you may have. I think I may have read this somewhere. Your relationship with John kind of helped you get Deus Ex or put you in the
Oh,
position.
it didn't help. The game wouldn't have existed
Yeah,
without him.
yeah.
I mean, I came up with kind of a proto Deus Ex proposal when I was at Electronic Arts, and they weren't interested. There was no interest in it. Anyway, I'll make a long story as short as I'm capable of making anything. And there came a point where I was working with Looking Glass. There were some financial problems, and my studio. I had a studio here in Austin, Texas, and we shut it down because there were financial problems. And I was about to sign a contract to do the Command and Conquer role playing game, which was going to be Deus Ex with a different fiction, and because that was the game I was damn well going to make. And before I signed the contract, John came along. I mean, he called me up and said, "Don't sign that contract." And he drove down to Austin from Dallas in his big Hummer. I mean, making a grand entrance with that hair. And he offered me, the Godfather deal. He just said, "Make the game of your dreams with no creative interference, biggest budget you've ever had, biggest marketing budget you've ever had." And I mean, I was in. And so I joined Ion Storm, built an Austin office for Ion Storm because you'd have to blast me out of this town with TNT. I'm not leaving. Um, but yeah, I mean, without John, I probably would have been making the Command and Conquer role playing game, and you and I wouldn't be talking.
So with Deus Ex specifically, at one point did you realize, that you had made the game of your dreams and that you had a hit on your hands?
I mean, I knew exactly what, I shouldn't say that. From a conceptual standpoint and a high level, from a vision standpoint and a kind of a narrative standpoint and an approach standpoint and a philosophy standpoint and what questions I wanted players to uh, answer through play. I mean, all that stuff. I knew exactly what game I wanted to make, and there was no question about that. But at the end of the project, 3 years later, every detail had changed because the team came along. You want to hire people better than you are and smarter than you are, and I did. I mean, Harvey Smith, who's gone on to bigger and better things, who understands immersive sims better than I do now, for which I hate him. But no, I love the guy. No, I shouldn't say that, even joking. I love Harvey and I'm so proud of him for what he's done. But I had Harvey Smith as my lead designer, you know. I had Chris Norden, an underappreciated guy, as my lead engineer. I had a great team on that. And they like I came up with all sorts of stuff and they just came along and said, "No, Warren, no, no, let us handle this." And so the details changed, but it was exactly the game I wanted to make. I mean, the vision was expressed perfectly. As far as hits go, I don't think about that stuff. I
Mm-hmm.
mean, I don't think about money and I don't think about audiences. I make games for myself and I am officially never going to get funded again, having said that out loud. But um no, I mean, I've been lucky enough that enough people like my games that I get to make another one. Everybody has their own success criteria, and for a lot of people, it's sell a gazillion copies and make somebody a lot of money. Probably not me, but I'm going to make somebody a lot of money. And for me, it's like I want to do things nobody's ever done before. I want to influence things. I want to hear other developers say what you were saying before. Man, they didn't know a game could do that.
Yeah.
And most important of all, I tell my teams this all the time. 20 years from now, well, I mean, let me put it another way. People are still talking about and playing System Shock, a game that came out 30 years ago. And people are still talking about and playing Deus Ex 25 years after we ship. And people are still talking about and playing Epic Mickey 15 years after we ship. That's success. And Deus Ex in particular, I won't name names or companies, but you don't want to know. You probably do want to know, but you're not going to find out. How many designers and other companies said they changed the way they thought about design, or they started their studio, or they got into games because of that game? And I'm not bragging about that, but what I tell my teams is that's what you want. You want to make things of lasting value. And at the end of the day, 20 years from now, the guys working on the game I'm working on now, 20 years from now, I want them looking back and saying, I can't believe we did that.
Yeah.
Can't believe we did that. Not, well, we made some money.
Yeah. Well said, man. We appreciate it. Just speak before I ask you this question. Do you still game?
Not as much as I used to be completely honest. I tell people who get into the game business that with rare exceptions, like some folks on my team now who are still crazy hardcore. When you start making them, you play fewer, you play less.
Yeah.
Um, so it's a career hazard, and I have fallen prey to it. I'm not happy about that, and I don't like to admit it. But most of my gaming is playing the games I'm working on now.
Okay. Because just speaking about what you're talking about, the impact and doing something someone's never done before and the game being played 20 years later. I think Larian did that with Baldur's Gate 3. I don't know if you heard about it
Yeah,
or how much it's,
yeah,
but that's one that
yeah,
speaks to me currently. And I think that they hit on what you're talking about. And I just
yeah.
was going,
Baldur's Gate. I've played some Baldur's Gate 3. What I do is I well what I used to do is play a game until I got bored or I got furious or I had learned what I needed to learn from it. And now I try a lot of games. I play a lot of games um, for a while. Like I said, I've got a team of people who just, I mean, like one guy has 1,000 hours into 7 Days to Die. I mean, how do you do that? How do you do that? Um, but I try to play every game my team is playing,
mm-hmm.
but I play a bit. And here's the sad truth. This is going to happen to you someday. You're not going to believe it, but you're going to get older and your interests are going to change. I mean, like, I don't want to kill another zombie as long as I live. I just don't care. I don't care how fun a game is. I'm done with zombies. I'm done with being the last space marine between the Earth and alien invasion. I'm done with playing a fantasy guy with a big sword who looks like Thor. I'm just done with that. I need different kinds of content. And in addition to that, you're not going to believe this. Your Twitch skills are not what they used to be when you get to be my age. I am incapable of playing a lot of games,
Mm-hmm.
um, which also doesn't help. But I have played like between 15 minutes and an hour of a lot of games. And that is the sad truth. That's my gaming life now. I do more board gaming, I think, than computer gaming and video gaming now.
There's nothing wrong with that, man.
Now, twist my arm and make me talk about games.
So, out of all the projects you've worked on over the years, which would you consider the single most challenging? Is the one that you lost sleep over more than the others?
God, I lose sleep over all of them. I mean, ask my wife. I'm up at 4 in the morning thinking about games, the game I'm working on or the games I'm working on all the time. I mean, I losing sleep is a great way to put it. The toughest development, that is a little different way to think about it. What was the toughest development project I've ever had? I don't know. I mean, they're all hard. Making games is gruelingly hard, and if you don't love it, it'll kill you. But I remember when I was working at Looking Glass, I used to say when people got down or burned out or whatever, I would say in this tone of voice, our lives are so hard. We have to make games for a living. So as hard as it is, you're not curing cancer. World peace is not threatened if a game fails. So you got to keep it in perspective. You're making games. How bad can it be?
Well said. Okay, in the same vein, in the game development space, what's the best advice you've been given, and who gave it to you?
Well, the best advice I've been given. I thought you were going to ask the best advice I've given. Um, the best advice I've been given. Wow, I've never been asked that before. I don't know. I mean, it's funny because I clearly was mentored by Steve and Richard. Okay, this is not exactly game development specific, but um, I observed and was told about the power of the word no, and that the way to win an argument is to be willing to walk away from it. And people think, I mean, like I have a well-practiced line that I used to be stupid enough to tell people I wanted to fund my projects. And this is a well-practiced line, okay? I make the games I want to make, the way I want to make them. And if you don't want that, don't try to change me. Let's part ways now and stay friends. And I've always been willing to walk away if I don't get to make the games I want to make. I'll just stop making games. I mean, this is the whole immersive sim thing and playstyle matters and all that. I mean, that's not just words to me. That is a mission, and it's the only kind of game I want to make. And if I can't do that, I have no interest in making a die roll game with character classes and big swords and all that. I actually want to make a basketball game someday. Okay, just because I don't know how to do it, and I love
Ah,
basketball. Um, but I'm willing to walk away and open a bookstore. Hey, I could do it out of this house. Um,
first customer right
but
here.
yeah, people no people often say, yeah, it's easy for you to say that because you're successful and you can get away with it. And it's like, ask my wife. I was saying that when I was 28.
Hmm.
When I had nothing. Um, it's again, I'm not. This is not about the money for me, and it never has been. This has been this career has been really good, and this business has been good to me, and I'm not going to be disingenuous and say it hasn't. But the the way to do what you dream of is to be willing to walk away from that dream when people try to stop you from achieving it.
Mm, well said. So, a question I like to ask at the end after people have opened up a bit, and hopefully they'll share. Have you ever had an experience that you would consider supernatural, paranormal, or an event you can't explain?
Not really. I honestly don't believe in that stuff.
Hey,
Okay. But the one thing I will say is, I was with my dad. I don't, I think we were driving home from Watkins Glen. I'm a car freak, and we went to the races, and we're driving home, and I think that's where we were coming from. Anyway, we were uh, the kind of the countryside outside. I grew up in Manhattan, so we were
mm,
outside of the city, and we were in crazy bad traffic, out in like kind of the country. And I looked up and I saw three lights up in the sky moving in a pattern. And my dad saw it too. And a couple of days later, I read a story in the newspaper that a lot of people had seen those lights in the sky. And so that's probably as close as I've ever come. I mean, to this day, I have no idea it was, weather balloons or UFOs or whatever. I don't know.
we're gonna go with UFO. Just leave it at
Yeah, okay, there you
that.
go.
That's the fun.
Yeah, it was
That's the fun
UFOs
answer.
for sure.
Well, Warren, just to put a bow on this thing, man, what's on the horizon for you that you can share?
OtherSide is working on a game called Thick as Thieves, which we announced at the Game Awards. The trailer is out there for people to look at. Um, I can't say much about it, but it's a multiplayer game of thievery. So people can check that out. And I am working on a game that I can't wait to talk about that is completely insane. It is unlike anything I've ever worked on. People are going to be furious at me the way they were when I worked on a Mickey Mouse game. Um, no, this is crazy. This is crazy.
That's what we like to
So
hear.
yeah, well, you say that now. We'll see when it ships.
And we can look forward to that 300,000 word cartoon history.
Yeah, I'll keep you posted on that.
All right, man. Well, Warren, I appreciate you giving me some of your time. Had a good time chatting with you.
Yeah, it was great being here. You asked me a lot of questions I never thought about before, so good on you.
Thank you, man. You have a great rest of your day.
All right, you too.